Good. So as I said, I mean, also, as Max already mentioned, we had celebrated our 100th anniversary, and in preparation for that, a global commission on the future of work with some eminent thinkers and intellectuals and policymakers, etc., were assembled for 2 years to discuss a bit the different challenges that the future of work is waiting has in the sleeves for us. And one of the topics was obviously looking into artificial intelligence. And as I was part of the secretariat for that global commission, it was my pleasure actually to work on this really exciting topic, and with new challenges, I think, both obviously for the world of work, but also intellectual challenges to understand and grasp all of the intricacies that we have. So as part of that work, a couple of papers came out. I'll share with you at the end of my presentation where you can find them. But I think what I wanted to introduce you today is what I call the AI trilemma, and I'll try to explain to you in a minute a bit what it is. But in a nutshell, and I think I mentioned it yesterday very briefly in my introductory remarks, is trying to understand the convolution or the simultaneous challenges that artificial poses both for the world of work, but also for ecological sustainability. And so just to give you my take-home messages here at the very beginning, is what we see in particular is that there is basically a sustainability problem at the heart of these new technologies, which is to say that we cannot have basically low inequality, high productivity, and high sustainability simultaneously, at least not the way we currently deploy these technologies. And I will come back to that at the end of my presentation a bit to see what alternative routes might be there to change that. And so so the second key message, and that's where I will start my presentation, is to say that basically the technological progress, and in particular artificial intelligence, has delivered neither. We see rising inequality, and not only because of COVID, that was already happening before, at least in advanced economies. We see low productivity growth, and we see a high ecological footprint that these digital technologies have. And as I said just earlier, there's one way out, is that we need to kind of find we need to direct this technological progress and have a proper public data management that will allow us to use these technologies productively and in a way that it helps addressing both the inequality and the ecological footprint that they bring. So let's start. I mean, here this is basically a summary of what I call the trilemma, and I mean you're certainly familiar with most of the elements here, which is and I'll go to give you some statistics later on. But I think especially on the inequality area, what we are most concerned is not only that it provided incentives for digital companies to create these huge conglomerates, but it also drives out a lot of traditional high-paying occupations in especially in manufacturing, but increasingly in services. And that's actually something where especially AI is targeting to a certain extent occupations, well-paying occupations, and replacing them with machines. I mean, in a sense, that's the intention of it, but at the same time, it certainly leads to a further deepening of polarization that we had already been seeing before. And at the same time, I think what's really interesting here is that we don't see much of the productivity gains that are promised with these new technologies. Actually, in a forthcoming publication, I was speculating to what extent these new technologies lead to an increasing number of gadgets, but not to a more productivity, not to a higher standard of living. And you see that is obviously a long-standing trend. We saw that already since the 1950s, at least in G7 countries, that the average productivity growth has declined, with a little blip in the 1990s as some of the ICT booms kind of produced some productivity productivity gains in specific sectors. But since then, nothing happened. And if anything, the 2010s have been a huge disappointment, despite the fact that that was the period of time where AI really took off massively. So we don't see much. And obviously you say, okay, well, maybe it's still coming. I mean, that's the argument that some research have, that, oh, we don't see that because it hasn't really transpired enough. But the question is, can we expect that comes automatically, or do we actually see some barriers to this diffusion of new productive ideas in the rest of the economy? And actually we do see, and I think that the key issue to that is, what we do see is this rise in inequality. Now again, that's a long-standing trend here. This is data that goes back all the way to 1984. That's actually a bit more than G7. It's like a G10 country sample from OECD countries, and you see that continuous increase in the Gini inequality here. But you can use other measures of inequality. You can have the traditional job polarization indicator. We have some evidence on that one as well. And that comes on top of, actually, what's interesting, it comes on top of a decline in job destruction rates. So this red line actually measures how many jobs have been destroyed. And what you actually see, it's not so much that people were unemployed, but rather somehow the jobs that were there, the benefits that these jobs gave, they were distributed very unequally. Yeah? And AI might actually make this worse. So there are some statistics that I don't show here, but that you're certainly familiar with, this to show that how much of the benefits, how much of this technological rents, if you want, the technological gains are shared only among a very few highly productive, highly innovative companies, whereas the rest of the company demographics, if you want, is not benefiting from it. And there might be many reasons for them why that is the case. I mean, but part of the reason is certainly that the way this innovation works, the way that especially the digital innovation works, and is protected in that little sphere, kind of doesn't provide enough incentive for these innovations to spread and to provide a much larger impact on the economy as a whole. And I think the last point I wanted to make in response to these challenges is that, so people were mentioning all along that, oh yeah, but AI will now come and bring us all these efficiency gains, and we will be so much having such a savings in terms of different types of costs, especially obviously energy costs, and this is true. I mean, you see some of the examples already. Google claims that it has lowered its electricity bill by 25% just by using AI tools to manage its electricity network. But as anybody who's doing environmental economic studies knows, that there's this huge rebound effect. Yeah, so whatever is savings you have is often overcompensated by an excessive use of this new technology, and that's the same for AI. You see on the right side is some kind of a projection, but more or less people will basically claim that because of this rapid progression of digital tools and the enormous energy hunger that especially cloud computing devices have, will basically overcompensate. So we're talking about currently an electricity footing of all digital tools together of 6% of the overall electricity bill that will go up to 20% by 2030. And so obviously on the top of a further increasing electricity bill. So it's to say that these tools for the moment are relatively energy hungry, and there's a reason to that. I mean, I cited here Chris Booth, who is a German AI expert, but others have said the same. Basically, that is an underlying in the technology, an underlying limit to how much energy improvements you can get. And obviously, if once everybody hopes that with quantum computing or new forms of biological devices, this energy footing will lower. But for the moment, we don't see that happening. We don't see that kind of being available at a large scale, so to kind of counteract these rather increasing, rapidly increasing energy bills. So in terms of what this means for the labor market, and I think that's where we see why this trilemma happens, is that most of the current effects of artificial intelligence really happens at the left side of this chart. So if you think about as an economist of how new technologies can impact the labor markets, you have basically three ways of doing that. You can either automate jobs, so you kind of basically shift workers who are doing these jobs into other occupation, and that may go up or down depending on what other jobs are available. You can make the existing jobs more productive, so that would be the ideal situation where you kind of make everybody more productive by, for instance, instead of using a hammer, using a machine that produces kind of produces the same output much faster. And I think that's where we would want to see much more of the effects of artificial intelligence. It can have a systemic effect on improving system efficiency. And one way, for instance, to look at this is if you implement artificial intelligence tools, for instance, in transport management systems, by improving intermodal competition, etc., you could potentially lower enormously, for instance, the cost of traffic jams, the cost of congested roads, especially in inner cities, and help to kind of reduce the overall electricity, or the overall energy bill of such systems. As I said before, I mean, Google claims to have used AI for its own electricity management. Again, that's something you can use, and there are other examples that we can talk about later on. But for the moment, the brief problem is that most of the AI effects are concentrated on the left side, not so much on the middle and the right side. And I can show you a chart where we can see this a bit more clearly. So this is only the two dimensions that I showed before, which is automation on the horizontal axis and improved, if you want, productivity on the vertical axis. This is from a work that was done by some researchers at the University of Nevada in Reno, Frank Vossen and Alina Sorgner, and they basically kind of use the entire occupational space in the US, and the size of the bubbles basically tell you how big these different occupations are, and then match these occupations with a current understanding of how much AI will impact these occupations, either by kind of removing them totally. So the probability of computerization goes up as you move to the right of the chart, or by improving the productivity by basically making these occupations more productive. So that's the vertical axis. And as you can see, there is again this polarization that happens. So a lot of the jobs, especially low-skilled jobs, are concentrated on the right. So these people are typically the ones that are likely to lose their jobs over time. Whereas the ones on the left are the people that are likely to improve and see a rising salary as well. For instance, if you think about a medical doctor who has now a tool that allows him or her to more easily identify diseases. Now, what's interesting, we applied that same chart or that same logic to other countries. You see that's for the US. Now, if you look at Thailand, actually, you see that most of the things in Thailand happens on the right side. So a lot of jobs will just disappear. And that's also something we found in other work when looking more closely on robots, etc., is that automation is the focus, especially in emerging and developing countries, because these countries are typically further away from the production frontier. So here the problem of losing jobs and kind of worsening the inequality by moving these people into, for instance, the informal economy is much worse than in advanced economies. So again, you see that for the moment, the way the technology is being used is mostly against human labor and not so much in order to improve the overall efficiency of the system. Now, this part of it has to do with the fact that we still see a lot of automation going on in manufacturing. We still see, especially in countries in low or middle income countries like Thailand, you see a lot of automation still available in agriculture, for instance. But what's really worrying is the fact that you see increasingly these tools, and that they're meant for that, obviously, to kind of creep into service sector, typical service sector tasks, if you want. And so here, some people at Stanford University started to analyze the patents and the AI patents that are currently at the US Patent Office and match them with tasks that are typically being identified with the current occupational set or classification. And when you do that, so you see some example patterns. So what is being replaced, etc. And when you match that with actual skill levels, you see that most of the skills are actually not so much low and middle skill. There's people with graduate education that or some university education at least that are being targeted. So what you would expect from that, that's actually increasingly high-skilled, middle and high-skilled occupation in service sector are increasingly targeted by that, meaning that these people are also likely to, at very least, see their occupation to shift and maybe to decline over time. Now, the big question is, what do these people do? And one of the answers that at least the late David Graeber gave on this was that, well, people move increasingly in jobs where they don't see any particular use for it. And especially in administration jobs, you see a strong increase. So everything related to compliance, to anything that kind of improves or kind of makes the bureaucracy work is as some of these jobs are rising, and you see that's for healthcare in the US. You have similar pictures for Switzerland. Obviously, not everybody can work in administration and healthcare, but you see other jobs, for instance, in the gig economy, where people kind of start taxi riding or on platforms, or offering their jobs, offering their services on a platform. So these are maybe one of the exit routes for people who lose their relatively well-paying jobs from their earlier occupations. Now, what would be the answer to these questions? And so typically people say, okay, well, we need more skills. Now, that's certainly true. And here this is from a study from McKinsey. I think that was done in 2017. So it's already, in a sense, outdated, if you want. But clearly, the study shows that technological skills are part of the answer. But not only, and if you look at the second highest category here, you see that social and emotional skills are certainly something that is highly valued. And I would expect if you do the same survey now, you would actually see that this is even becoming more important. Obviously, not everybody can work for Google simply because Google is not big enough in terms of employment, but maybe social emotional skills, especially in personal services, healthcare, etc., would be a way out for these people and would maybe give them a new way of finding meaningful work to do. But that still doesn't solve the problem. How do you actually make sure that the inequality that is implied by these technologies would be addressed? And there, you need to really go into the data economy as such and understand what's problematic with the current way of the data economy. Now, this is probably not the time to go into much detail, and I guess all of you are familiar with the kind of the basic premises of it. But what it boils down to is basically the property rights in the data economy are ill-defined in a sense. They're not allowing for an easy sharing of the benefits that come from it. The data portability is not guaranteed. For anybody who is using any of the social media knows how difficult it is to move from one network to another. We don't really have open innovation system, especially not data sharing system. There are some ideas floating around how to do that, but it's not really properly being implemented yet. And last but not least, I mean, the input that you give as a user to these platforms is not properly rewarded. I mean, you get the goodies in terms of Facebook sharing some pictures, etc. But you don't get any monetary reward out of this. And I think that's something that certainly needs to be addressed if you want to make sure that these rents are more properly or more widely shared in the economy. Yeah? Yes, I mean, we move into areas that are typically more standard macro policy areas like taxation. We need to find a new way of setting up a taxation that is commensurate with the particular challenges of especially international, multinational companies that share their contents across borders. Digital taxation is a highly debated discussion, especially at the OECD level. Then the flip side to it is obviously we also need to provide social security for these people, especially those that are providing the services on platforms, as they cannot or have not yet the same type of rights that that people have had in the past in their traditional, let's say, in the standard forms of work. There are ways of profit sharing. This is being discussed, but obviously that is always only helping you at the firm level, not so much at the sectoral level. And then one thing that I certainly promote quite a bit is maybe there is a way of looking at this data economy as a public good, and as any public good, it needs to be maybe. Then there is a way of mobilizing it at the national level or even at the international level, creating sovereign data wealth funds that would allow to kind of use these benefits that are being generated by this data economy and share them more widely. The one thing I always say is if you had invested I think it was $5 in an Amazon share in 1999, when Amazon, or 1998, I think, when Amazon was set up. By now you would have I mean, an enormous amount of money. I think it was, I don't get the numbers right now, but it's half a percent of GDP in the US that you would get out of it if you just would capitalize on your investment. So it was an enormous increase over a short period of time, and I think if that's something that as a nation we could benefit from, that's certainly something helpful. And then the last point, and that brings me to my very last slide today, is one thing we could think about where these tools are actually helpful and where they could go beyond the current automation time of automation targeted application, is to strengthen resilience and to use what I call AI as a collective intelligence tool. So, you know, often I mean, it sounds a bit pompous to call this transforming capitalism, but it boils down to very massive transformation of some of our infrastructure technology. So for instance, I mean, I mentioned some of it before already, improved market performance in electricity, telecommunication, broadcasting. Paul Milgram gave a very interesting example in one of the books on AI, and how changing broadcasting systems in the US has benefited enormously by using AI. In my field of expertise on talent management and human resource management, there are increasingly uses of artificial intelligence. People don't know yet exactly fully how to implement it, but that's certainly something where if we can use AI as a tool that helps us to improve the way our labor markets work, that would be an enormous benefit, and that would certainly overcompensate some of the costs that come with these tools. Something else, but certainly related, is digitalization of intangible assets. Tomorrow I will hosting a webinar here in Geneva with a friend of mine from the International Monetary Fund, where he will kind of tell us about valuing natural capital, and he has a theory and a model behind it. But in order to make these models work, you actually need AI tools to implement them, because often you need to get the next step and have something, a digital tool where you can record these assets. Similar for competences, skills, etc. You could do digitalization around these things. I mean, there are people. There's a company in California called Eightfold AI that tries to do that, and I think these are the way forward for some of these tools to implement. And then the last point, which is obviously extremely relevant in the current situation of the pandemic, is maybe these tools can also help us improve resilience. Maybe we can have early warning systems where kind of certain risks are being detected early on before actually they appear on anybody's radar screen. Also network analysis to prevent sudden collapses. We see occupational networks, transition networks that have specific characteristics that are not amenable to an easy shift on competences, and understanding these networks, understanding how they prevent us from improving a functioning labor market or functioning healthcare system, it could help us. And in order to do that, you actually need this type of machine learning tools that will analyze these networks more more in detail in order to come up with recommendations on how to address that. So that's my kind of take on it. Obviously, all these collective intelligence tools come with a big caveat, which is algorithmic collusion, which is for the moment more of a discussion rather than that there is any empirical evidence for it. But it's certainly to keep in mind that this is, for me, where I would say, if you really want to make these tools productive and want to address this, what I call the AI trilemma, this is the kind of direction we need to take, and we need to improve we need to maybe direct our technology and our legal institutional framework in order to make these tools usable in that area. I promised you some links to research. So this is the couple of things that we did in the past few years. If you go on our research website, you will find some more up-to-date information, and people, some of my colleagues are especially working on digital platforms. So you can find some work on this as well. And then very last slide. For those of you worried that you lose your job, this is actually an interesting website. You can test out whether your job is particularly concerned. I would guess that most of you are not concerned by losing your job anytime soon, but it might always be interesting. I have tried it for myself, and as an economist, I seem to be relatively safe from losing my job anytime soon. So with that, I thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Ekkehard. This was really brilliant. I think clearly the diagnosis is absolutely spot on. Sort of the risk of increased inequality, polarization in the job market. I think I see on the chat there was a lot of take on the bullshit jobs label, and increasingly a number of young people not able to find jobs in the first instance, which is an even bigger problem. Now, before I open to questions, I have one that I just wonder whether you can tell us something about what does the ILO do in order to try to push governments to try and adopt some of these directions that you're advocating, some of the policies to try to redress some of the problematics that you've identified, because clearly we need the voices of organized labor of a coalition that is strong enough to counterweight some of the clear pressure that private companies, commercial companies, and big platforms are putting on governments to just hang on, just let it all be. So what does ILO do to try to help counteract those pressures?
So, I mean, as part of this, as I said, as part of this Global Commission on the Future of Work, what we did was we organized national dialogues. And there's actually a publication, I should have referenced it here as well, on which kind of summarizes these discussions, which is really important. I mean, as you know, the ILO, as any UN agency, we are mostly a dialogue platform. We're obviously norm setting as well, but we are first and foremost a dialogue platform where we try to bring social partners and governments together and discuss what are the challenges and where to kind of focus their policy attention. And I think part of also this presentation and the work that my colleagues are doing in this is in that spirit. So we need to kind of discuss with policymakers. We need to show them what are the possibilities. We do have very concrete projects with different countries, especially on skill developments. We have very concrete projects on social protection. As you know, the ILO has, together with the World Bank, some years ago defined the universal social protection floor, especially for low and middle income countries. And I think these are policy tools that we try to promote and where we try to link them up to the latest technological challenges. I think that obviously that's not enough. I mean, you might rightly say, and we certainly need to kind of push forward. Funny enough, actually, something relatively little known is, and that concerns more the privacy discussion that you also had previously. We do have a code of conduct from 1997 where worker privacy rights were kind of clearly identified and policy recommendations given on how to protect them and how to ensure that that there is a fine balance between the interest of employers using some of these data and the interest of workers to being protected against abuse of these data. So I think we do have actually a couple of policy tools, and again, it then boils down to, I mean, promoting some of these messages. And one of the things I mentioned here in my second to last slide is this declaration that came out last year, where we basically have identified a number of policy areas, including skills development, including fostering occupational transitions, and including things like social protection that need to be, and strengthening institutions on the labor market that we believe need to be pushed forward in order to help shape the future of work in the direction that we believe is relevant. Now, I mean, all this to say that obviously the pandemic also came for us at a I would say unfortunate moment, in the sense that we don't really have the right tools, for instance, for the moment at least, to address this. And plus, I mean, we are not a health organization, so for us we come also always on top and at a later stage when it comes down to cleaning up the problems on the labor market. So we are currently trying to kind of identify how we kind of combine the challenges that we see from this longer term automation trend with the current difficulties, the current dire outcomes on labor markets, especially, as you mentioned, for young people, but then also for low skilled and for a lot of people in low and middle income countries.
Now, thank you very much for that. I can see on the chat that there's quite a lot of activity, but before I turn to some of the more senior colleagues, I wanted to know whether Ernst, Helen, or Christina have any questions for you. I would like to give them the priority, if I may, since they are at the forefront of their PhD studies, and that might be a nice opportunity to ask some questions. Anything from you, Helen, Ernst, Christina? Everyone gone very quiet. Okay, while you think about it, anybody else would like to pose a question, raise a hand, come forward. You all seem to be very quiet. Michael, Peter?
Sorry, you've seen a lot from me on the chat, I think, so I'll pop up face-wise, shall I?
Yes, yes. And
I was standing back hoping for some of these younger folk to have a go. As you see, I'm a real old-timer. Okay, while you're thinking, a couple of things I've put on the chat which you might be interested in. I actually work labour markets, and then I've had the privilege of being amongst these fellas doing these dynamic, wonderful systems. Quite interesting to me about the difference between Henk's presentations and Ekkehard's. Henk's stuff is dynamic, it's got time, it's got space, it's got intricacy. Of course, it tries to model the real world. We get to Ekkehard and we go economics. What we get are graphs, two-dimensional. We get measurements which have got to be measured internationally. We get productivity, output per capita. We get a graph of that. We get inequality. And what strikes me is that in the future that I'll be long gone from, we need to be able to try with the labour market to be able to have a more dynamic proposition for how the labour market works, a more detailed proposition, a more local proposition. And that would take us to methodologies that are much more dynamic in their form, much more time-driven in their form, with much more space in their form. Otherwise, what we're doing, I fear, is looking at the lens of the world we're in and going more deeply into with lenses that are good for economists. I'm not rubbishing economists, I work with them a lot, but good for economists because they give you good, hard, solid data with sectors, with categories. McKinsey can make wonders of them, project futures of jobs for the rest of the millennium. But in the end, the world doesn't look like that. And then I think, see, that's been the joy for me, being part of this DigiTranScope thing. It's just taken me to somewhere else in terms of the dynamics. Just something I was going to put up to Henk earlier on was what I would really love to see is Henk's business. We kind of know from data now. In London, he just asked me this question, that only 50% of the office workers of the big city, central London, are planning to go back at all. This is the workers planning to go back to the office. They're going to work from home. Actually, the firms are more interested than the workers now that they've seen and again, we can talk productivity benefits of having their workers and all the overheads and the huge city centre cost. So 50–60% of the office workers who went into London 8 months ago may not be going to go. I'd love to see a digital model that you guys do, which would say, okay, and you can do it. What would a city look like where 60% of the office workers that used to go in don't go anymore? What are the cascading multiplier effects? Who else is going to alter? How would you, on your Minecraft, which I'm still a fan of, how would you design a city that just doesn't have, it only has a small number of these high-flying people in the middle having dinners and whatever. So it's a long speech, this, but I just think it's great to see these two things of labour market theory and the dynamics of DigiTranScope put together. I'd like to see more of it.
Yeah, I think that certainly, Peter, this sort of kind of transition about the tools and the methods that you knew, the dynamic of market and the spatial dimension, which is obviously something that, Ekkehard obviously didn't have the time to cover. I mean, it's a global organization, but clearly there are huge spatial dimensions into this changing of jobs. I mean, you alluded to the Thai case, but obviously this is, some of these technological advances are also enabling the repatriation of jobs that have been sort of kind of exported elsewhere. So that is all functional to the agenda of us first. And then within countries, we see big regional differences between, more advanced parts of the country, less advanced, rural versus rural. So, there are all these spatial as well as dynamic changes that are taking place. And how we analyze them and what kind of response we can provide is also a function to our ability to analyze the event properly. So, Michael, you wanted to add to Peter?
Yes, I will. I was halfway through typing it, but I'll say it. I think what Peter's picking up is absolutely crucial, because, as I think I mentioned yesterday, we have a spatially decompressed urban society now with less space. But two things. One is what's happening in some sectors is that the employers are installing much more sophisticated software in the houses of workplace. Banks, for example, are putting virtual reality systems into the houses of some of the trading floor people so that they can simulate being on the trading floor. The other big growth that's been picked up is in surveillance software, because you've now got a lot of people working from home, and watching from a distance electronically has become a major growth area. So people will be working at home not knowing that their key depresses, their activities, are actually being metricated and measured. So surveillance at the home workplace as well as surveillance in the physical workplace.
Yes, another interesting shift. Any comment on those, Ekkehard? So what steps have been taken at ILO to, sort of take advantage of the digital change of AI, of digital transformation, to refine your analysis of the shifts in the labor market and the responses to that?
Well, I think that the first point that Peter was making about a more detailed and more kind of real-time analysis is certainly something that we felt the urge to do as well. And I think that especially with the COVID crisis, where you don't measure labor market developments in years or quarters, but rather in days or weeks at most. I think that's something we started doing as well. And for those of you who have followed a bit what ILO does or has published in the recent months, we try to kind of find new ways and using all different types of new kind of more granular data, both time-wise and spatial-wise to do that. I mean, the one challenge I would say, and I mean, Peter, you're absolutely right, and I apologize in a sense for that, is that we always have this problem that internationally comparable data is really hard to come by, and we have to somehow find a balance between, on the one hand, our standards or statistical standards that we need to apply to different countries, and the additional data that can give us more granularity. The spatial dimension, I totally agree with you. I think that's something which we, at the subnational level or city level, is something that we miss totally. And I myself try to do it, but I mean, the thing is, there's very few countries where you can actually do such an analysis properly. One thing I would add, and I mean, I try to kind of emphasize this a bit, but maybe it wasn't quite clear. I totally agree on the idea that we need to bring in new forms of capital into the discussion. I think that the way we look at economies right now, by looking only at physical and financial capital, is not enough. And I mentioned before, we have this colleague from the IMF that comes tomorrow to one of my webinars on natural capital, but there's also the way we measure human capital. There's not a proper measure to it. I mean, if you talk to HR manager, I find it the most frustrating part of it. If you talk to HR managers, they see workers as payroll costs. They don't see them as investment. And the question is, how do you change that? How you can actually convince them that the person you have on your payroll is not only a cost, it's a contributor to your success, to your business success. And one of the ways doing is finding new ways of valuing this human capital. And I think that in this sense, digital tools can help us. And so me, my team, people in the research department, but other people at the ILO as well, we're trying to develop new tools, kind of valuing skills and trying to understand at a very granular level, what do these skills add to a company, to a sector, to a nation, etc., in terms of its contribution to income and wealth. And I think we are not there yet, but we're getting to it. And I think we're developing quite little by little these tools that help us to improve a bit our statistical picture, but eventually also improve then our policy messages that we can give to both businesses and governments.
Well, certainly having a better understanding also of the environmental capital and how even the opportunities from COVID to re-question our previous model of production. So it's in a good way to say technology may increase productivity. It's still the assumption that you still want to produce as many cars, as many goods for consumptions. And the fact of starting to say, well, do we really need to own as many cars? Do we really need to travel as much? Do we really need to consume as much? Or in the same way, can we think of how to bring together this digital and environmental in order to have a more sustainable development? I mean, these are all things that would be much more strongly supported if you could value natural capital and the environment and sustainability better from even a financial point of view to make that kind of argument. So there's certainly a case. I see Alberto and Igor want to make a question.
I think that Peter wants also to say something. Well, maybe.
Yeah, let's
that you raised the hand, Peter. Okay, no, it's okay.
Yeah, let's go to Alberto first. Yeah, I'd like to change a little bit, and then we can get back to Peter if need be. Alberto?
You want me to speak up or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Nice to hear your voice.
Okay. I was just asking, I mean, we were doing some investigations on how innovation works in three sectors here in Spain, and one of them was labor, and we found out that there is non-participation of unemployed and other communities, usually immigrants or vulnerable communities, into the co-creation of the next labor markets or measures, or so to speak, any tools dynamic tools that could help simulate or at least make up for what will be the next round of policies regarding labor. And you know that Spain has a endemic problem with labor, right? So, but still we don't count on the use or on the opinion of those that are mostly affected by that. And I don't know if you've seen anywhere else pilots or I don't know, projects willing to collaborate with these communities to sort of develop policies, labor markets, etc.
Giving voice to those who are not in labor. Yes.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I haven't seen anything, but that's also because I don't necessarily work in this area. But I mean, I know that some of my colleagues, especially those who work on cooperatives and social enterprises, I mean, I'm pretty sure that they have, and I'm happy to establish a contact if you want to talk to them.
Please, because I feel that the statistics, and particularly if we're speaking of integrating dynamics and emergent phenomena into what could be the next big thing or the next thing, probably it needs to sort of, that idea of collaboration to be integrated somehow together with conventional ways of developing labor markets. Thank you.
Igor, you wanted to make a point?
Yes, I think it's the right time, and thank you, because I think that we are in a right sequence. I know you know what I'm going to talk about. The question of Alberto, I think, pointed out a very important thing that we've been exploring in DigiTranScope in the last, let's say, a year. And it's exactly what Ekkehard, you have mentioned about the platform and data cooperatives. So coming back to the point that Peter mentioned, I think it's very crucial that you contributed to with how to merge the static economical perspective and the dynamic technological thing. So it's very exploratory piece of research, the one that we have been producing in the last year. So my question is to you, Ekkehard, because I didn't find you very convinced about potential alternatives in the data cooperatives based on data on platform cooperatives. Yesterday in the groups, we were discussing about potential alternatives. So what's your opinion on thinking about cooperatives based on platform driven by data in order to dignify the work? Because I think that there is a very good discussion about the tyranny of meritocracy by Sandel, that is exactly saying that, well, the work shouldn't be based on merits, should be based on dignifying the worker in itself. So I think it's a very crucial debate. So the question is very clear. Are cooperatives these days the potential alternatives for dignifying work and, let's say, reshuffling the way in which data economy could suggest an alternative model?
Well, Igor, if I can just slightly broaden your question to Ekkehard, I think that Ekkehard, you made reference to also the need to find new ways of redistributing the added value from the data economy. And I think that clearly cooperative is one of the mechanisms that could be. So if I could maybe, Igor, if you allow me just to expand your the question a little bit more, is just to see whether you see alternative models that are coming out in the data economy for this greater redistribution to workers, and that's the dignity dimension comes into being as being, part of, stakeholders in the process to the current, sort of models of extraction, if you want.
No, I mean, I'm sorry if I mentioned it only very briefly, but I agree with you. I think that there's certainly a possibility to value and to valorize the input that people give. But first of all, I think that the problem really is that our current intellectual property rights system doesn't provide enough incentives, especially for big companies, to actually set these type of data cooperatives up. I think that we have a really big issue in that respect, that data collection is highly protected up to a point that you actually, as an individual contributor to that collection, you don't even have a control over what's being what's being used and what kind of information is being used. By the way, that's not a new problem. I mean, for those of you who come from Germany, I know that we have in Germany, for instance, a system for that banks have set up to protect themselves against excessive credits, and so you basically redlined into different categories in this system, and you don't have any control over what kind of information banks collect. And that's an old system that dates back to the 1960s, also when we didn't talk about digital data. My bigger problem is that I would say is that even if you kind of allow people to contribute and to take money, or to kind of being rewarded, if you want, not money necessarily, but if you're being rewarded by contributing that, it's not entirely clear for me whether that would solve the inequality problem, because, and that's something that Hal Varian, the ex-chief economist from Google, actually pointed out to, is that the way these algorithms work, and they basically reward variance. So if you and me, we are on the average, we wouldn't get rewarded at all. Whereas if you are an extreme case and contribute a lot to the improvement of this algorithm, you would get a large reward, whereas I, as an average user of that, wouldn't get any reward at all. So the inequality problem is, I don't think, is properly solved. You can solve that only if you aggregate it at the national level. That's why I kind of started with the idea of this sovereign wealth data wealth fund. I think that's a more promising solution, even though it's even more of a utopian political suggestion. But I know that even Dirk Pielert from the OECD shares some of the same views on this, and I think that it could be potential something where countries might actually be interested in setting up these type of tools and extracting the rents that these digital companies do much more effectively than when you start setting up these data unions. Max, you're muted.
If I can take the last question, I'll take the opportunity that Ernst, one of our PhD colleagues, is there, and she would like to ask you something. So Ernst, do you want to go ahead?
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I'm not an expert in economy, but I just have a question for Mr. Ekkehard about data economy that you talked. Do you think that capitalism is transforming in digital capitalism or surveillance capitalism, with data being the means of production and means of behavior modification, and AI the tools for surveillance? Thank you.
I think as the way it currently works, we are probably more moving towards a surveillance capitalism. I think that's the exact the worry that we all have. I would say. I think that the incentives for the moment are set in such a way that we're moving in a sense in the wrong direction. And interestingly enough, Karl Frey recently shared a paper from some of his PhD students on demonstrating how these technologies provide actually incentives, especially for those authoritarian states that want to use these technologies for more surveillance technologies. I mean, that's clearly it's clearly a direction for anybody who has ever been to China knows how massive and invasive the surveillance is there. And I think that's certainly a concern. And Max, you mentioned yourself before that how companies are setting up now surveillance tools because of people working more from home. I think that the incentive for us, I think, and that's where I would say needs to play a strong role, is that we need, if you want to make sure that the data economy is the one that is kind of providing us if the data economy is the one that is driving our future wealth, I think we need to make sure that we set the right direction, and that's clearly a strong restriction in terms of what you can do in terms of surveillance with the data that you collect. I think is one element that needs to be part of the equation.
And the redistribution of wealth through various mechanisms and welfare, I think you alluded to those, are enormously important. Well, Ekkehard, it has been a great pleasure to have you with us. I hope you'll have still the time, if you have, to pop in. We'll share your email with the colleagues, so if they have any questions, they can follow it up. Can I ask then everyone to unmute themselves, so that then we can give you a big round of applause, and thank you very much for the presentation. Also for the previous presentation, so thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a well-rewarding cup of coffee or tea or something else, and let's re-adjourn at 11:15, if I'm not mistaken.